Welcome back, Beans Army, to another episode of the Less is More Sports Podcast, the college offseason podcast where you could say we're less of the regular season, but more of the offseason. We're continuing the series here on the Less is More Sports Podcast where we go down the line of every team in every Power Four conference and say who had the best, or what, sorry, was the best offseason acquisition. Here joining me today to talk about the Big Ten is a good friend of mine, Rob Sheply of Witty CFB. Rob, thank you so much for joining the show.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It's always, a great time to be on with you, talking some ball. And now that it's June, I feel like that's the time where, it's actually time to actually, break down some rosters, talk about the coaches, kind of see where we are with recruiting and, and it's nice kind of the all the dramas away from it now too.
Oh, 100%. Give the audience a chance to talk about what you talk about on at Woody CFB.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I started this podcast about 2 years ago, and it just got to be one of those things where I was writing for a website, and it was going good. But then I asked myself, why not just do this on my own and kind of have a little bit more freedom with it? So, I mean, I just talk ball with people who are just as like-minded and enthusiastic as I am, and just try to have more engaging conversations than just the typical cookie cutter stuff that you see on some other channels. And that's how Les and I met, and here we are now. So it's just great to be here.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you. And if you're listening, definitely give Woody CFB a follow at the end of this video or during the video, whichever you prefer. But anyways, we're going to dive right into the Big Ten Conference. We got 18 teams, and we're going to talk about the best offseason acquisition for each team. We are going to start with the Illinois Fighting Illini. Coming off a 9-4 season, the Illini have to battle a losing overhaul of offensive starters and almost an entire defensive coaching staff. So, Rob, who is the biggest acquisition for the Fighting Illini?
I mean, for me, I think you got to start at quarterback with Caden Hooser, who, had a brief stint with Michigan State and then transitioned to East Carolina, where he went 13-6 as a starter. I think he has a lot of similar skill sets as Altmaier. I think if you look at them statistically, it's actually pretty similar. But I think the one thing that Hauser has differently than Altmaier is I think he's a little bit more athletic then I think Altmaier is a little bit more athletic, so I'm kind of curious to see how Hauser can stand in the pocket too, especially with this now new offensive line. They're going to see it with Illinois, and there's a lot of new starters coming in, especially when this time last year we were talking about Illinois as a top 25, possibly even a playoff team if they can really kind of get the right run. So I think there's going to be a lot of moving parts here.
I like that Rob went on the offensive side of the ball. I stayed on the defensive side of the ball. Their defense ranked 57th out of 136 teams last year, which isn't horrible, but still not the greatest in the world. But you insert defensive coordinator Bobby Hawk, 15 successful seasons at Montana, registering 13 playoff appearances, 4 national title games, 20 playoff wins, and 8 Big Sky Conference championships. Now, remember that is FCS, not FBS. But he brings with him a 3-3-5 defense, which I have mixed emotions about myself. It can bring an aggressive blitz that can be very confusing for quarterbacks to read, but also playing in the Big Ten Conference, they're stereotypically known for being a physical running offensive. A lot of teams that predicate on downhill running, and that is something that the 3-3-5 can't struggle against. So that's what I went. I went with Bobby Hawk for the defensive coordinator from former defensive coordinator from Montana. I apologize. But coming in at number two, the defending national champs, which is so weird to say, the Indiana Hoosiers, coming off a perfect 16-0 and first national championship in program history. Who will help the Hoosiers in their quest to go back to back? Rob, who we got?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of different directions that you can kind of go in here. I would say in terms of, guys being able to keep, I think Charlie Becker, I think he's one of the best players in the entire country. But I'm gonna keep it on the offensive side here and go with Nick Marsh, a transfer from Michigan State, who quite frankly was a guy that, brought a little bit of light to this Michigan State offense. I mean, you can ton of different directions you can go, particularly in the offense side of the ball, because they brought in a lot of transfers, but look at this kid to be a really good complement to Charlie Becker, who I believe is probably one of the top three receivers in the entire country. But I'm kind of imagining myself, if I were an Indiana fan, I think to myself, with this combo of Charlie Becker, Marsh, and you got Preston in there too, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Marsh to get some touches along with Chaz Preston, who's another transfer from Tulane. So I'm really excited to see what Josh Hoover and Turbo Richard have in terms of some weapons there.
I cannot stress enough that there is no right or wrong answers here with any of these decisions, but it is funny that you said Nick Marsh because I remember when Indiana landed Nick Marsh, I tweeted out that Indiana's trying to go back to back and they haven't even won the first one yet because that was just such a big deal when they landed him to transfer from Michigan State during the college football playoff run. But you went with the wide receiver. I'm gonna went with the guy that's gonna be getting him the ball, and I went with Josh Hoover. And the reason I went with that is the top two quarterbacks last year that led the nation in RPO passes. Number one was Fernando Mendoza, and number two was Josh Hoover. So if you're Indiana, if you want to replace your Heisman winning quarterback who helped lead a team to a national championship, it makes the most sense to go with a guy who, at least on paper, is used to that kind of play calling. So that's why I went with Josh Hoover on that one.
And he has a lot of those similar skill sets too. I think what I'm curious about with Hoover is I think especially with TCU, I mean, they're throwing the ball 40, 50 times a game, which is why I would argue that a lot of the times that people get nervous seeing his stat sheet in terms of the interceptions. But I think that's more of a factor of, hey, you're throwing 40, 50 times a game. Any Sonny Dykes coached offense is going to be top 10 in in the country. So I think a lot of that's going to translate over, and especially they have such a great staff over there too with Mike Shanahan leading that offense.
Oh, 100%. And plus, India, like you said, Indiana's going to run the ball a lot more. It's going to be a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Balanced.
Balanced. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
lot more balanced rushing and passing attack for sure. Coming at number three, we have the Iowa Hawkeyes. Coming off a 9-4 season, the Hawkeyes have their own quarterback battle heading into camp, along with replacing key players on defense. But who is the biggest acquisition for the Hawkeyes?
Yeah, so I mean this one's I mean I feel like I'm such a Iowa homer because I think Kurt Ferentz is such a great dude, and I'm definitely kind of curious where we go from there. I mean, there's one obvious guy that I think we're both pretty much going to mention here, and it's Lendon Phillips Jr., the running back from South Dakota, just shy of 2,000 yards with 19 touchdowns, and at least for me, one of the most electric FCS running backs that we saw last year. And when you put him with Kamari Mullen together, I mean, that's a pretty exciting duo, and especially when, at least for me, there's definitely some question marks in terms of the quarterback position with Hank Brown and Jeremy Holenke kind of still battling it out for that spot. I think it's gonna be nice that you have that one-two duo again.
And I like every now and again, I like to keep people on their toes because that would be a very obvious answer. But
Exactly. Yeah, I had it. So
I,
someone had to say it.
right. But I went with Tony Diaz, a wide receiver, and he was a major transfer from UT Rio Grande Valley who committed to the Hawkeyes. He's former FCS freshman All-American, brings much needed playmaking to the receiving core and possesses 3 years of eligibility remaining, which I think is very huge. Or no, sorry, he possesses 3 years of our eligibility already. And Kirk Ferentz loves his players with experience. So that's why I went with Tony Diaz at wide receiver. Coming at number four, we have the Maryland Terrapins. Coming off a 4-8 season, the Terrapins need a big year from Malik Washington and are now under a new offensive coordinator in Clint Trickett. But who is the Terrapins' biggest offseason acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to go with the 5-star and Zion Ely, and I think the Terps don't get enough credit for the amount of progress that they've had last year, considering that they won their first four and then they gave up a couple fourth quarter, leads there, and it kind of makes me wonder if they can kind of clean that up, and especially when you have Zion Ely, who's a five-star kid and definitely bound to be a legit threat. And then you pair him with Sidney Stewart and Sahir Mathis, who combined for almost 21 tackles for loss and 13 sacks as a freshman. I mean, they got a pretty nasty front seven there, and I definitely think if we're going to be talking about Maryland as a team that we can see as a 7-8 win team, especially it's such a big year from Mike Locksley. I think that's the position that you have to start with.
Oh, 100%. That's our first agreement on the players because I also went with Zion Ely, the highest ranked recruit in Maryland history, which is amazing to think about. But also, you don't get player comps to Will Anderson for nothing. And I know, like, in the recruiting world, we can kind of take player comps with a grain of salt because at the end of the day, they're all different. But when you're getting comped to a player like Will Anderson that had such a successful career at Alabama, that's doing great things at the Texans right now, I mean, that's some very high praise. And now you pair them with a Maryland team last year that had 27 total sacks as a team, tied for 68th in college football. Again, not horrible, but definitely room for improvement. And you insert a five-star talent like Zion Ely, that's definitely the biggest offseason move, I think, for the Maryland Terrapins as well. Coming at number 5, the Michigan Wolverines. Sharon Moore is gone. Kyle Whittingham is here. The Wolverines will rely on the progress of sophomore quarterback Bryce Underwood and will have to deal with an overhaul of roster movement, but ultimately look to get back to their downhill and physical defensive identity. So, who is Michigan's biggest offseason acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of different directions you can go here, and I think at least from a player perspective, we can. I think you'll probably either mention Andrew Marsh or Jamie French Jr., who's transferred from Texas. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about Jason Beck, their new offense coordinator that Kyle Whittingham brought in from Utah. And I think the big question for me, if I'm looking at this Michigan team, is aside from Whittingham from a recruiting perspective, perhaps how he connects to a lot of those blue chip recruits. My other question is how does Jason Beck take a guy like Bryce Underwood, who has the intangibles, he has the raw capability and a decent arm? How do you maximize that? Because you saw what he was able to do with Devin Dampier. There's still some questions in terms of the wide receiver room a little bit, aside from two of the guys I'm sure that you'll mention. But I'm definitely excited to see how he maximized that because I think without a doubt Underwood showed a lot of flashes of excellence last year, and he rushed for over 500 yards. So I'm kind of seeing how can he maximize his ability and how can he be a little bit more efficient and reduce the mistakes.
So, surprisingly enough, I didn't go with the former Texas transfer, but I did go with a former Texas target and freshman running back, Savion Hitter. And the reason I went with Hitter is this is a kid I watched a lot of tape of. And it's very easy to see why 247 player comps him to Amarion Hampton. And when I look at Michigan and what their identity's been, not only the last 10 years, but really since I've been a college football fan, again, it goes back to that downhill running and physical defensive identity that they possess. And Hitter is the perfect running back that, even as a freshman, is talented enough to come in day one, can not only compete for the starting job, but provide that rushing attack to get Michigan back on track to what makes them who they are. So that's why I went with Savion Hitter. I know that's a surprise because I was big on Jamie French when he committed to
Yeah,
Texas. I wanted to
absolutely.
see him work out, but I think Cam Coleman's all right too. I'm not going to be too mad at it. But going from Michigan to the other Michigan team, the Michigan State Spartans, the first year under new head coach Pat Fitzgerald, who is Pat Fitzgerald's biggest acquisition, if not himself.
I gotta say, you know, I, I feel like Pat Fitzgerald, the whole thing has been pretty polarizing. I, for one, am probably defending Pat Fitzgerald a lot more than other people, but that's probably for a different conversation. But nevertheless, I think we're gonna go back to the running back room, and I think we got to talk about Cam Edwards, who was the running back for UConn last year, rushed for just over 1,200 yards, and I really love that they made some subtle moves there. They brought in four transfer running backs, some offensive line depth. I think is still going to be a little bit of a question mark there, but the good news is they have sophomore quarterback, uh, Alesso Miliosovic, and I think combining him with Cam Edwards, I think it's going to be definitely a boost in the rushing attack there. I think most importantly, just getting a little bit of less pressure off this sophomore. So I'm definitely kind of curious to see how they can kind of make that work.
Absolutely. Rob went with a running back. I went with a guy that's going to be blocking for the running back, and I went with transfer center Trent Fraley. Began his career at Marshall, but transferred to North Dakota State, where he started 29 games and won the FCS Remington Award in 2025. I just want to stress the importance of establishing a physical front line that Pat Fitzgerald knows he needs to have to compete in the Big Ten. So that's why I went with one of the more coveted or higher resume acquisitions in that transfer portal on that offensive line. Coming at number 7, the Minnesota Golden Gophers, coming off an 8-5 season last year, despite the fact that they were undefeated at home. What can help the Gophers Or what acquisition can help the Gophers in 2026 with those road woes?
Yeah, I'd say first and foremost, I think PJ Fleck deserves a lot of credit for how consistent he's been over the years. I mean, considering that over 9 years, eight coordinator changes, seven bowls. He's been remarkably consistent, going, at least winning 7 games plus, and it kind of makes you wonder, like, what if, he was able to, get a little bit more some offensive weapons, but that's neither here nor there. But I think at least the guy for me that's kind of on my radar that I think is a little bit probably on the lower scale. I'm going to talk about Perry Thompson, the wide receiver from Auburn. And I think one of Minnesota's big keys for success and something I think is going to be the difference between them having the ceiling of 7 to 8 wins versus a possible 10-win season is where can they find these kind of unproven blue chip guys that have kind of, been bounced around the depth chart, and how can you maximize that? And I think Perry Thompson is a lot of those raw athletic abilities and a solid route runner. How can you maximize a guy like him to be able to get Drake Lindsay kind of over that hump? Because you saw him make a lot of big time throws, but how can you make it so that Minnesota is doing a little bit better than just averaging 20 points a game and only winning primarily because of all the pressures on their defense every year?
100%. And I'm glad you said, how do you maximize these blue chip guys that kind of fell under the radar? Because that's exactly who I went with my pick. And I went with Bennett Warren, the right tackle transfer from Tennessee. He's an elite talent, 6'6", 6'7", height with a wingspan over 7 foot, a former four-star recruit. I'm hopeful that he can live up to his recruiting profile and give Drake Lindsay more protection in those hostile road games. Coming in at number 8, we have the Nebraska Cornhuskers. This is a crucial fourth year for head coach Matt Rule, and the Cornhuskers will now have to produce without former starting quarterback Dylan Raiola, who is off for Oregon. So, who is the biggest acquisition for the Nebraska Cornhuskers?
Yeah, I'd say first and foremost, from Nebraska fans I've talked to, most of them don't really seem upset that Dylan Raiola decided to be the backup at Oregon. And another thing about Nebraska is their recruiting class this year was 67th, whereas the past couple years they were in the top 20. So I think it's just kind of something just to note in terms of the, Nebraska in general. But in terms of, transfers, I feel like we got to talk about Anthony Calandria. I mean, obviously, kid from UNLV had a ton of success with Dan Mullen, and I think Calandra is, at least for me, is a guy who's really fun to watch. He's a guy he's a definitely a pretty heavy scrambler. I think doesn't take as many sacks as Raiola, but I think much like Raiola, he's a high risk, high reward kind of guy. And, he's had 9 multiple interception games throughout his career. And I guess my question is, how can Matt Rule and Dana Holgorsen, this offensive staff, be able to clean that up? Because at least from here, I definitely think it's a little bit of a either stagnant or regressive year, especially since they don't have Tony White as their defensive coordinator who left this all season too. So I'm just not so sure about Nebraska, even though I love the tradition of Nebraska.
Oh, 100%. I feel like Nebraska is one of those teams that we talk about on the podcast that college football just seems more fun when they're good. And
Absolutely.
you went with Anthony Calandria, who had 3,459 yards last year, 23 touchdowns at UNLV. I went with the guy that's going to be calling his plays, and new offensive coordinator Dana Holgerson comes in from the school of Mike Leach, the air raid up-tempo offense. He has a track record of producing numerous 3 to 4K passers every year, and he can work wonders with a guy that had a lot the same that had the production that Anthony Calandria had last year. Coming in at number 9, we have the Northwestern Wildcats. Went 7-6 in 2025, but made one of the biggest splash seasons in the offseason. And Rob, I don't want to sway your opinion, but I'm just gonna leave it at there. So who is the biggest offseason acquisition for the Northwestern Wildcats?
I mean, Les, no need to leave the elephant in the room. I mean, obviously for me, it's Chip Kelly. I mean, it's got to be him as an a coordinator. And you can say what you want about his ending at UCLA, but at the end of the day, he's an established mind, and I think a lot of people kind of thought to themselves, why would he take a job like this? And I think you take a job like this because you don't want all the headaches and the pressures that that a lot of head coaches have. I think he's in his 60s where, quite frankly, he's done everything. He has nothing to prove to anybody. So to be able to take a team like Northwestern, who is coming off a pretty sensational year for Northwestern standards. You open up Ryan Field in October. I'm not going to mention the transfer, the quarterback transfer we brought in if you're going to talk about him. But I'm just kind of intrigued about how Chip Kelly can maximize these guys because I think it's going to be a lot of fun for Chip Kelly to have a new challenge. But I think at the same time too, when you haven't finished within, you know, top 50 in offense since 2019, it's going to be a fun road for him. But man, do they have a brutal schedule this year?
And I can't stress enough, like I said at the very beginning of the episode, there is no right or wrong answers, but I do feel like Chip Kelly was the obvious pick here, and that's why I went with him. I mean, he's one of the most notable offensive minds in recent memory in college football. I'm interested to see how the blur offense is going to work at Northwestern, but I mean, this is a guy that very recently helped Ohio State win a national championship. So, I mean, the guy can still coach. Say what we can say what we want about him, all the other baggage that comes with it, but when it comes to offense, Coach Chip Kelly knows what he's doing, and I'm interested to see how it works.
I left the door open for you to talk about Aiden. I didn't know if you were going to mention Aiden Giles.
No,
That's who I thought you were going to say.
no, absolutely. I thought about it as like it's Chip Kelly though. Like,
Exactly, because I'm still a little puzzled by it, but at the same time, like I think it's cool that a guy like Chip Kelly is taking a job like this because I think he's got a lot of crap for the whole Raiders thing and the UCLA leave. I think it's more that he's just not on the West Coast anymore. Probably threw me off more than anything.
oh, 100%. It is a little weird, but still, like you said, the elephant in the room that had to be addressed, and I think that's
Yeah,
why we both went with Chip Kelly on this one.
exactly.
Going from Northwestern to number 10, a team that Chip Kelly, ironically enough, helped win a national championship, the Ohio State Buckeyes. 12 and 2 a season ago, and as always, championship aspirations for the Buckeyes. But they will have to overcome a massive defensive shakeup. So, who is the biggest pickup for the Ohio State Buckeyes?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think we obviously get to talk about Terry Moore, the safety. I mean, when I kind of think to myself about Ohio State. I mean, Matt Patricia had the best defense in the entire country. So many elite players throughout the roster, and I think the one thing about what Ryan Day had to accomplish this offseason in order to get back to a national championship, it was the secondary. That was definitely the number one biggest issue that they had going into this. And I think they did a great job by picking up Terry Moore from Duke. Now he did tear his ACL last year, but if you go for those of you who watch the ACC and remember flash to Terry Moore, I mean, he was one of the best defenders in the entire ACC. Six six tackles for loss, four interceptions, a guy who's just all over the field. And I think Ryan Day and Patricia are going to find some really creative ways to use this guy.
Oh, 100%. And this is a guy that I watched a lot during his time at Duke, being a Duke fan and all. And
Yeah.
I mean, he's got big shoes to fill because he's replacing one of the best players in college football last year in Caleb Downs. And now I'm not saying Terry Moore is Caleb Downs, but he is a guy who had 71 total tackles, like Rob said, seven tackles for loss, one sack, two forced fumbles, four interceptions, and six pass deflections last season. So yes, Terry Moore is who I went with. He is a big time player. The only issue is he may just have even bigger shoes to fill. But I do also want to add that it was very hard for me being a recruiting fan in my core to not go with Chris Henry Jr. because that man is
Oh,
he
absolutely.
is
Yeah.
a man amongst boys out there. I mean, just I remember where I could tell you where I was at, the infamous highlight where his quarterback throws it up and the DB actually picks it off initially, but Chris Henry just reaches in, takes it, and just takes off for a touchdown. I'm like, that's not normal. But anyways, that's why he's a five-star talent like that he is. Coming at number 11, the Oregon Ducks. Oregon is facing a championship or bust expectations this season. And they did have one of the most surprising returns, if you ask me. But who is the biggest acquisition for the Ducks this offseason?
Yeah, I almost want them to be my national championship pick because I really do believe that Dan Lanning will win a national title. I just don't know if it's going to be with Oregon or if he just kind of hits a wall and goes elsewhere. I think if you ask me, he will win it with Oregon at some point. There's just so many guys there, but I think you have to mention Coy Parrish from Minnesota, and it's he's just one of those dudes that is going to be a legitimate difference maker back there. Because when I kind of asked myself, hey, they brought back a ton of great names like Amari Washington and Bear Alexander, and you kind of ask yourself, how do you get this team from, you know, stalling in the playoff versus being able to kind of get there? And when you have a guy like Brandon Finney Jr., here's a shutdown corner, and now you have Coy Parrish to kind of complement that free safety position. Man, I think that that's going to be really exciting. And I'd probably argue that I'd probably take Oregon's defensive look right now, probably aside from Ohio State, really over anyone else in the country, just because of how experienced these guys are and the amount of proven talent between the transfer guys and Finney and Alexander and all the guys I just mentioned.
I didn't want to go with the obvious answer here, but I went with the obvious answer here, and I picked Dante Moore coming back.
Yeah.
And honestly, and this might be a hot take to some people listening, if Moore had stayed in the draft and I was part of that Las Vegas front office, I would have done everything in my power to sway them to take Moore over Fernando Mendoza with that number one overall pick. When you return a quarterback that I believe could have been the first overall pick, it just doesn't get much bigger than that. It returns elite play at the most important position. Everyone buys in. Not to mention, and even if you want to set up for the future, it helps develop Dylan Raiola coming in and sitting and learning under him for a year. So that's why I went with Dante Moore as my biggest offseason acquisition for the Oregon Ducks. Coming at number 12, the Wisconsin Badgers, 4-8 last year, and is a make or break year for head coach Luke Fickell. Now, there is an obvious answer here, but do we go with it? Talking about quarterback Colton Joseph coming in from Old Dominion.
No, I mean we don't have to. I don't think we have to mention him. I mean I think we could even go with a guy like Nate Palmer who's from TCU, who's going to be a really good kind of running back for him. Because when I think of Wisconsin football, I think of the days of Ron Dane, for example, who were and Melvin Gordon even who were super strong and can break through tackles. And I think that's kind of what's missing with this Wisconsin team, especially when you think of the offense of Phil Longo. But I think they're getting in the right direction with Jeff Grimes, and you add a guy like Colton Joseph or Nick Palmer or what have you. I think that's kind of that missing piece to finally get that running game going again, because I think it's pretty obvious that yes, they are definitely more talented than they were last year, and it seems like that they're kind of being a little bit more selective in terms of bringing in guys from the portal, but fortunately, you know they are moving in the right direction. So I'm just kind of curious where they go from here, but I think they're gonna have some tough sledding in terms of the schedule.
100%. And I also did not go with Colton Joseph either. There's a reason they say the highest paid player on the football team is the quarterback and the second highest paid is the left tackle. I don't question what Colton Joseph can do, so no need to talk about him. But the biggest move to me was getting the blindside insurance, PJ Wilkins from Charlotte, rising talent who worked his way from a zero-star recruit to now a three-star transfer prospect. His development and how well he can protect Colton Joseph's blindside will determine whether or not Luke Fickell has a job next year. Coming at number 13, the Purdue Boilermakers. Can Purdue rebound from a 2-10 season and the inaugural season for Barry Odom? But who is their biggest pickup?
Yeah, I mean, Purdue is one of those jobs I would say, aside from Auburn, one of the toughest jobs, if not probably one of the toughest jobs in the entire country, especially when you think of so many of the losing campaigns that they've had over the years. And but I do like Barry Odom. I do think he's a solid guy, and especially when you realize that that your neighbor in Indiana is just having the run of their life right now. But I think you got to talk about Jarrett Gibson from Texas, another running back who I I think will definitely help Ryan Brown out, who I think is a pretty solid quarterback. But in order for them to kind of get past, the at least to try to get the 6-6, right? That he definitely needed a better supporting cast around him, and Purdue obviously is not going to have a lot of returning guys, but to be able to add, like I said before, to be able to add those guys that were a little bit more overlooked, look for him to be able to make a difference on this team and hopefully get them a couple more wins this year.
I didn't want to go with the sellout answer here, but when you have a historically weak offense a year ago, you have to rebuild the foundation at that offensive line. And I think for Purdue to go out and bring in five transfers on that offensive line, I think that's where it starts. So I didn't want to sell out and just say like, "Oh, I'm going to pick a bunch of guys," but when you have a bad offense like that, you need to work on that foundation, and that's why bringing in five transfers on that O line, I think, was the most important thing that Purdue went out and did this offseason. Coming in number 14, the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, 5-7 a year ago. Some major storylines are their own quarterback battle, a revamped defense, and how much of a load can Antoine Raymond carry? But who is the biggest offseason for the Scarlet Knights?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aside from Penn State, I really try to follow Rutgers football as much as possible, and man, was this defense hard to watch last year, which is totally uncharacteristic of a Greg Schiano coach team, ranked dead last year in terms of yards allowed, and it's just something that's really, quite frankly, inexplicable. And I think you have to go with Travis Johansson, the former South Dakota head coach, who takes the helm as their defensive coordinator. And it's tough for Rutgers to be able to really go out and try to find these coaches. One, because there's a lot of financial instability with the program right now. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but also, it's a really difficult place to recruit. I mean, even though it's the birthplace of college football, not a lot of people want to go to New Jersey to play college ball. And, yes, the Big Ten is an intriguing spot, but, let's face it, in order for probably by choice and necessity at this point, there had to be a complete overhaul of the coaching staff, in particular on the defense side of the ball. And, Johansson, with the amount of success that he's had in the Midwest, and also be able to kind of tap into those top FCS guys and be able to be a little bit more creative in terms of the recruiting trail, I think he's definitely going to be the biggest addition. And, it's going to be one of those things too, where, when you have KJ Duff and Antoine Raymond, who are two of the best offensive players, not only in the Big Ten, but in the entire country, that defense has to step up a little bit and even just become respectable at this point if they want to get back to, that 7-8 win ceiling that I think you have with Greg Schiano.
And that defense being respectable is exactly why I went with Ty Morris, the Rice transfer. I'm interested to see what he can do because I watched a little bit of tape on him and he forced 34 tackles and two forced fumbles. Don't blow you off the page statistically, but he's got a little bit of kick to his step. So I'm interested to see what he does, and that's why I went with Ty Morris.
Yeah, that's a
Coming in at
good
number
one too.
15, we got to speed through these 3 minutes to go to the podcast ends. UCLA 3-9 a year ago, first year under head coach Bob Chesney. Who is the biggest acquisition for the Bruins?
Goes without saying, Wayne Knight, obviously, JMU running back who, super electric and is going to be a real difference maker for him.
I'll say I have to stay on brand with my show. Matt and I talk about how JMU is becoming a developmental coaching tree in its own right, and not talk about, and I just can't not talk about the head coach, Heil. After what we're seeing at Indiana, any major program who needs a new coach, they might just want to check out JMU at this point. But the real test for the JMU lineage would be if Billy Napier gets a job after his stint at JMU. Coming at number 16, the USC Trojans. It's a make or break year for Lincoln Riley, and the Trojans bring in the number one recruiting class. But will one of those recruits be the biggest gain for UCLA?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great guys that I can mention. I mean, you just mentioned it, the number one recruiting class in the entire country. But, I think you got to talk about the elephant in the room and Gary Patterson. I mean, DeAnton Lynn decides to leave for Penn State, and you go with a guy, Gary Patterson, who was coach at TCU for a long time. And, there's so much upside with this defense, just a matter of can Gary Patterson, who is just a master of the 4-4-5, like, does he have enough tricks up his sleeve now that he's been out of college football for so long to maximize a lot of these guys? And I'm sure you can definitely have a whole episode about if you wanted to.
Oh, 100%. I also went with Gary Patterson, so no need to spend too much time on that. Moving on to number 17, Washington Huskies, 9-4 a year ago. We had the highly public debacle with Damon Williams in the offseason, but ultimately he is back with the Huskies. Who is their biggest offseason acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could probably mention DeAnton Lynn, just considering the amount of defensive success that they that they have. But I'll mention Keanu Williams real quick, who's a transfer tackle from UCLA, got a decent amount of playing time, and considering the turbulence, let's say that UCLA had, the highs and lows of it, he can be a really solid addition and be possibly a developmental guy, especially with how much beef they have on that offensive line too.
100%. But for me, I went with Demond Williams. I'm high on him. I think he's one of the better quarterbacks in college football. I'd like to see what he could do with more talent. I actually, on this podcast, suggested that Miami should look at him, but of course, they had to break my heart and take Menza from us. So unfortunately, that happened. But, anyways, I'm going to go ahead and get this out of the way. Like and subscribe to Less is More Sports YouTube and Spotify channel to get the latest updates we have on content coming out. Be sure to follow the social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Threads. It's at Less is More Sports. And Rob, Penn State, we got a Penn State guy here. Who is your all's biggest offseason acquisition?
Yeah, I mean there's a bunch of different guys that you can go with here. I mean, I'll just mention D'Anton Lynn. I think you got to. I think that's who we obviously got to talk about. I mean, he's you're overhauled this whole coaching staff. I mean, you brought a bunch of guys from Iowa State in, and one of the biggest issues I had with Matt Campbell is can he connect with those guys? So
Absolutely.